Bom dia a todo mundo que acompanha mais um DigiLabour Summer School. Meu nome é Rafael Groma, sou professor do programa de pós-graduação em comunicação da Unisinos, coordenador do Laboratório de Pesquisa DigiLabour. Hoje temos aqui para a quinta atividade do DigiLabour Summer School, o professor Guy Standing. A gente já recebeu aqui a professora Ursula Rios, o professor Christian Fuchs, a professora Juliette Shore e o professor Franco Pasquale. E hoje temos a honra de receber o professor Guy Standing, professor da SOAS, University of London, e que vai lançar a nova edição do livro O Precariado, agora em maio, junto com também a nova edição do livro A Corrupção do Capitalismo. E o livro O Precariado faz 10 anos agora em 2021. O professor Guy Standing também tem escrito bastante sobre a necessidade da renda básica e vai conversar com a gente sobre a raiva do precariado. Professor Guy, good morning. Thank you for having us.
Well, it's great to be talking to you. I wish I were back in Brazil in different circumstances with a different president. The last time I visited, I had the pleasure of meeting President Lula, and I wish those days were back in many respects, but I wish every Brazilian friend the very best.
Great, thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk today on several related themes, leading up to a focus on the role of anger. Anger is needed, but anger has to be coupled with hope. And I begin the analysis by saying that we are in the middle of the global transformation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. That ended in the 1970s, and it was the final phase of what I call laborism at that time. And it gave way to what we all know of these days, neoliberalism. At the time, it was called the Washington Consensus, and later on it evolved into structural adjustment and supply-side economics and various other euphemisms that were given to it. I want to make the key point at the start that we are not living today in an era of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has done its work. It was a project, an ideology that morphed into a system that we have today globally, which I call Rentier Capitalism. Rentier Capitalism is fundamentally different from old-style industrial capitalism in that more and more of the income and wealth and power flow to those who are taking rental income from the ownership of property, financial property, physical property, and most of all, intellectual property. In the process, the mechanisms and institutions have fundamentally changed, and along with the change has come a new global class structure. The global class structure, which I've discussed in the books that have been mentioned and elsewhere, essentially involves a fragmentation of classes, not a dualism, a 1% versus 99%, or what the populists like to talk about, an elite versus the people. It's a fragmentation which is based on looking at three dimensions of social relationships. The first and easiest way of describing this class structure is that we have a plutocracy at the top. It's not a top 1%, it's much smaller than that. They're global citizens with enormous power, and they're relying almost entirely on rental income. That's why the likes of Jeff Bezos and various other billionaires have made billions of dollars, euros or pounds during this pandemic lockdown, or what should be a lockdown and isn't in Brazil. The second group down is the elite, who are basically rentiers but have salaried positions. They're serving the interests of the plutocracy. We won't discuss those now. Below them, a long way below them, in terms of income and power are the two groups that are earning wages of some sort, or professions, I call them, rather independent-minded, technology-driven, doing a lot of things with apps and so on, and the salariat. And both these groups have some security, income security, and are earning predominantly rental incomes. And this means that their interests are fundamentally different from the groups below them in the social structure, and therefore forming an alliance with elements of those groups is going to be very difficult. Of course, below the salariat is the old proletariat, for which labor laws, labor systems, labor unions, labor parties, even the Workers' Party, they were oriented to protect the proletariat. And the key point is, of course, that the proletariat was proletarianized, meaning that they were habituated to regard stable full-time employment as some sort of nirvana, and they put jobs on a pedestal. Jobs, jobs, jobs. We want more jobs. But below the proletariat is the growing precariat. Below the precariat is a lumpen category, call it what you like, cut off from society, who are not class-based. And the precariat can be defined in 3 dimensions. And I think it's vitally important to say that classes have to be defined in this 3-dimensional way. The first dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of production, classic Marxian term, by which I mean a pattern of work, a pattern of labor that is the norm within the precariat. They're subject to having unstable labor, insecure labor. I hate the term precarious labor for reasons I'll come to shortly. Their insecurity is a matter of uncertainty, but it is not subject to labor-based forms of social security because they're facing uncertainty and volatility. More of their labor is indirect. They often do not know their employer. They are subject to having a feeling that they don't have an occupational narrative to give to their lives, a sense of occupational security, a sense of becoming something through their labor and their work. Very crucially, people in the precariat know, and thousands have written to me about this, that they have to do a lot of work that is not labor. And they have to do a lot of that work off workplaces and outside labor time as part of the normal way of surviving and trying to meet their subsistence needs. In addition, they find that increasingly they're being subject to forms of control that they hadn't anticipated and that was not part of the traditional proletariat existence. I saw an interesting earlier lecture in this series where they showed Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. This, of course, is a different system of control with Foucaultian principles and with a panopticon state and invasions of privacy, but fundamentally is increasingly being driven by apps. And apps not only in controlling your use of time, but your privacy, but also apps that are acting as labor brokers. That means they are exploiting people in the precariat by their transaction costs that they impose. Uber, various others, they charge 25% for every labor transaction. And clearly in this process of the precariat, what we see is another form of fragmentation. The first part of the app-driven are what I call the concierge existence. You are an on-call servant for consumers, which may come from across the class system, but you're essentially driven by doing odd jobs and you're acting as a servant. That's one form. The second is the cloud labor situation, the Amazon Turk and the various other systems where online labor is broken down into tasks. And those tasks are minute in terms of time and effort and minute in terms of payment. And this is a globalized labor process so that you may be finding you compete with somebody the other side of the world, in Goa, in Accra, or anywhere online with the requesters, as they're called, who are acting as the labor brokers. This is an indirect form, and the requesters themselves may be part of the precariat. And then, of course, there's the on-call type of worker who literally is waiting for his smartphone to come to tell him that there's something he can earn or she can earn by doing. This is a broken down type of atomized existence. And in the end, it leads to a strange phenomenon that's developed in the global labor process, is that within every occupational category, there are elites, there are salariats, and there are precariats, the legal professions, the medical professions, any of them. And that this means that often the higher levels within an occupational category are rent seekers, rent extractors from the lower categories. Now that leads to the second dimension. The second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution as a norm. This is the key word, norm. The norm is that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages. They don't get non-wage benefits that would give them labor-based security. They don't have access to rights-based state benefits, and they don't have access to the commons. The commons traditionally, historically, gave people in the working classes of the time some semblance of informal security. But the commons has been increasingly privatized and colonized and commercialized, and there's no longer a secure base to give income security in extremis. The wage that the precariat has to expect is both low, stagnant, volatile, and uncertain. One of the extraordinary phenomena of the recent decades is you see what are called the jaws of the snakes widening. It used to be the case that when productivity went up, wages went up. No longer. Today, when productivity rises, wages tend to fall, average wages. When employment goes up, it used to be that wages went up. No longer, often, wages fall. It used to be the case when profits went up, wages went up. No longer, it's the other way around. So these phenomena are characteristic of the income system that the precariat experiences. But very, very importantly as well, the precariat is living on the edge of unsustainable debt all times. Private debt is part of rentier capitalism. It is not an accident. It is how rentier capitalism operates. Rentiers want us all to be permanently in debt. They extract surplus value, call it what you like, from us through rental mechanisms. And this is the first time in history where this double form of exploitation through the wage relationship and through rental mechanisms have been the norm. There's always been debt, there's always been wages, but not as the norm of the income distribution system. And in addition, the third dimension, which is what is the most important, is that the precariat has a distinctive relation to the state. Unlike the old proletariat, whose primary antagonism is towards the boss, the employer, The precariat, the primary antagonism is the state. It is the state that oppresses them. And I use the term in the second book, the Precariat Charter, the subtitle is From Denizens to Citizens. Because today the precariat are denizens, even in their own society, in the process of losing the rights of citizenship, or in the case of migrants, not gaining the rights of citizenship, however long they stay wherever they're living and working. And this sense of losing social rights, economic rights, political rights, cultural rights, goes with the defining feature of the precariat. The defining feature. Nothing to do with insecure labor. It has something to do with it, but it isn't defined by insecure labor. It's defined by the fact that if you're in the precariat, you feel like a supplicant. The original etymological root of the word precarious in the Latin was to obtain by prayer, to obtain by begging, to obtain by relying on the discretionary benevolence of an employer, landlord, bureaucrat, parent, spouse, or whatever. A sense of not having rights, but having to rely on others in positions of unaccountable power over you. The sense of being a supplicant is what defines the precariat and why it is not right to talk about universal precarity or mass precariatization, because it is very specific. People in the salariat, who still make up a quarter of the population, they don't suffer from this sense of being a supplicant. They don't suffer from the combination of circumstances, and neither does somebody who's still in the old proletariat. So for me, this is the defining feature, this combination and this focus on being a supplicant. And you feel, if you're in the precariat, that you have no control over your time. You suffer from the precariatized mind. Should I do a little of this, a little of that, a little more? The sense of having what the psychologists call unbounded rationality. That's the reality for millions of people now. I cannot tell you how many people from all over the world, because my books have been translated into 23 languages, write to me about different features. And that leads to the theme that I want to emphasize, and I want to invite you, if possible, to educate me on, and that is the sense of anger. In my books, I talk about the 4 A's. Anxiety. People feel insecure, constantly facing uncertainty. A sense of anomie, a sense that you cannot escape from your predicaments. You don't have any hope. Durkheim's famous concept, and updated with a sense of abjection. Abjection means feeling cast off, feeling lost, feeling that there's no real hope. And it leads, of course, to stress and suicidal feelings, a sense of drift. That's a different sense of anger, because it's the anger against oneself. And the 3rd A is alienation. I wish the left could realize that being in a job is not emancipating. Being in a job, like Marx said, is being in a situation of alienated activity. We have to do it. We have to do jobs, but let's not romanticize jobs. Let's not pretend that the solution to the problem is more jobs. My late friend David Graeber, of course, coined the term bullshit jobs. And that's precisely right, because millions of people don't get their satisfaction or aspirations through the jobs they're required to do, and it will never change. That's That's acceptable, but let's not romanticize it. Escaping from being trapped in jobs should be the emancipatory agenda of all progressives. But there's a problem. And the problem is, of course, that the precariat is a class in the making, not yet a class for itself. It is split into three factions. The first I call the atavists, people who don't have a lot of education and have fallen into the precariat, and they look backwards. They look what their parents had or their communities had, or even they themselves had in the past. And being relatively uneducated and having that particular set of experiences, they tend to listen to the sirens of neo-fascist populism. They support the Trumps, they support Bolsonaro, they support Boris Johnson's, they support Salvini in Italy, and so on. These people are not being offered a tomorrow, they're trying to get back yesterday, or an imagined yesterday. We have to see them not as deplorables, as Hillary Clinton described them infamously, but as some groups who have to be offered an agenda that makes them not want to go in that direction, but to also become more educated and part of a compassionate future. The second faction are what I call the nostalgics. The nostalgics are people who've lost a present. They don't have a home anywhere, here or wherever they come from or wherever they would want to be. There are millions and millions more today who are belonging to the nostalgics. The nostalgics won't vote for neo-fascist populists, but they're disenfranchised. They are losing rights. They have fewer rights or the prospect of rights than their equivalents 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But somehow they have to be mobilized by seeing a future. And that leads to the third group. The third group are what I call the progressives in the precariat. This consists mainly of the young who was going to college and university, and they were promised by their parents and their teachers and their politicians for having a future. And they come out without a sense of future, except long-term debt, dashed hopes, frustrations, and finding a vocabulary and a sense of memes in order to survive. I happen to be very privileged in asked to examine, as external examiner, a doctoral dissertation last year on the precariat in China. There, the wonders of the millions and millions of people who are being pushed through education into the ant tribe and into the precariat are looking for a sense of future. And their subversive agendas and subversive vocabulary and subversive activities are the harbinger of something exciting. And elsewhere, this progressive part of the precariat have been disillusioned by the fact that the old social democrats, the old socialists, I'm on the left myself, those people were not offering, have not offered a future. An emancipatory future that restores the Enlightenment values of liberté, égalité, et solidarité. This is what is missing. The good news is that I think the atavistic part of the precariat, the size of that has reached its peak, past its peak, and is now going to be shrinking, whereas the progressive part is growing every single day. And they are looking for a future. As long as it's not being offered, they do the thing that most of us would do, which is stay at home. They don't vote. That's why in Britain, for example, Boris Johnson could win a landslide victory with only 29% of the electorate supporting him. 29%. The turnout was very low because the progressive part of the Precariat weren't motivated. They weren't sense of anger plus sense of hope in an agenda of reinventing a future. And this leads to my final few points. How do we turn the anomie and the abjection, the disillusion into a positive sense of action? And how do we develop a future in vocabulary, in imagery, that is going to offer this precariat a unifying, coherent possible? I like to use the Hegelian term of the negation of the negation. What that means is the first task is to identify what are the barriers to the realization of aspirations. Don't treat the precariat as a bunch of victims. Many people in the precariat have genuine positive energies that are different from old-style laborism. They're not victims. That's vitally important. Yes, there is some victims in that precariat, but the essential part of the progressive part is that they are frustrated. This is the anger that's married with hope. Where is the hope? I want it, and I'll respond to it. And I think this is where we stand today in the debate. One of the reasons I've supported basic income for the whole of my working life and formed Bien with others, and I hope many of you will join Bien, is that a basic income must be part of a package of emancipation. The COVID-19 pandemic should have taught even members of the salariat, members of the elite, one vital lesson. If some groups in society are left vulnerable, insecure, and as supplicants, we will all lack resilience to any shock, any black swan that hits us. You will only have strong, resilient society if every group in society is resilient. And you can only have resilience if you have basic security, married with the freedom to pursue your dreams, to pursue your passions, and to develop your work capacities in a zone of both solidaristic community and a sense of individuality. The left must reinvent collective action. The old labor unions are atavistic. If I want to clear the room when I'm talking to a group in the precariat, I often joke that I only have to start talking about the labor unions. They rush to the bar, metaphorically. But I'm a pro-union person because we need collective bodies. Except for a green transformation, we need different forms of collective bodies that understand the precariat and its aspirations and don't offer the old recipe of full-time boring jobs. This sounds utopian, but it isn't. It's a matter of saying, move in that direction. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you very much for listening, those of you who have, and I'm quite open to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Guy Standen, for your amazing presentation. The first question is mine, is how is the role of digital platforms in the composition of Rentier Capitalism and the Precariat? And you mentioned Amazon Mechanical Turk and so on.
Yeah, the digital platforms are defining the emerging labor process. And I think that within this decade, more than 1/3 of every labor transaction will be done online. And the old notion of jobs, in the sense of full-time, stable jobs in workplaces, will be sort of almost a minority by that stage. The trouble we have at the moment is that the response to the growth of digital labor is being led by labor lawyers and by trade unions that are trying to compress back the notion of jobs by trying to change the employment status and taking legal actions to do that. I see it's just been done in Spain. It's just announced a decision by the courts. And I think that is low-hanging fruit in the sense that we shouldn't be too frightened of digitalization. We shouldn't be too frightened that AI and automation will be giving us the opportunity to automate labor that is thoroughly distasteful, onerous, bullshit. I welcome any automated system that automatically cleans public toilets or cleans hedgerows or whatever. There are certain things that we should welcome, but just like the Luddites in the beginning of the 19th century, who were protesting at the destruction of a way of life without offering an equivalent instead. So digital platforms are exploitative and they're very dangerous in their current form. Typically, what are called unicorns start up as a platform startup. I saw one the other day that's just begun, and the man who's done it got a $3.4 billion within a week to help him get on with it. But these platforms are they're rent takers, they're labor brokers, and that should be stopped. That has to be tackled. They also have to be tackled by saying, look, these sorts of tasks have to be done, often convenient for people, but they can't be done in the current circumstances of chronic insecurity where desperate people are desperately exploited. So the real challenge is to say, don't hold back technology. Let's see technology advance, but remember these things. But the real problem is defeating exploitation. The real problem is giving people basic security in which they can take and bargain in positions of roughly equal power. And another thing about digital labor and digital work, which has received far too little attention, is that alongside the automation that people discuss is a process called heteromation. And heteromation is a very exciting area of study and politics, because what it's all about is that this is the first technological revolution in history which is generating more work than labor. If you are interacting with any app or any computer or any computerized system, more and more you have to do a lot of work that is not labor. More and more that work is not recognized in our statistics, in our politics, in our rhetoric as work. But we are doing it. We are working more than probably ever in terms on average. But it's not shown up in the statistics. So we have a number of different issues from the conventional subject of digital labor. I think we should welcome many forms of AI, but at the same time, we have to have control over that. We have to have good regulations. We have to have sharing of the benefits, stopping the rentiers taking it all. And then you have to combat what's called in my book on corruption of capitalism, predatory pricing. That is the worst single feature of the current evolution of platform capitalism. What happens is that an Uber or A&B or any number of these, what they do is they start up as private platforms mobilized by private equity. Behind the scenes, as I've documented in that book, the private equity says, you will not go public. Because if you go public when you're making a loss, the shares will drop and the profits will be disappearing, because your tactic should be not to make a profit. Your tactic should be to lower your prices in order to drive out your competitors or to operate as a barrier to entry to other potential competitors. So what you see is that for years, Uber runs at a huge loss. Amazon often did for a huge loss. Many of these, Deliveroo or whatever, they deliberately run at a loss where they're basically driving out the competitors who can't compete because they're very low rates. But they're only able to do that because of private equity behind them that's done a deal with them. Because they look at long-term profit making, and that's their business model. So I think that the platform capitalism must be looked at as a system of rentiers. And as such, we have to combat it as a very parasitic, exploitative system. But the technology is not the criminal.
Great. Thank you very much. Professor Standen, we have some questions for audience. The first is from Spillier. Professor Standen, is the pledge for the right to laziness, as preconized by Paul Lafargue, an interesting flag yet?
What a great question. Thank you very much for that question. I totally agree that the right to laziness is an aspirational right. And it goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle talked about urgia, laziness, and he emphasized that it's vital for the human being and the citizen to have adequate urgia. Cato later said that never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing. And I've taken that forward in my work by saying that actually the concepts which were looked at by Hannah Arendt in her wonderful book, The Human Condition, as we know, but which I think I have a slightly different focus, but it's a wonderful book. The right for contemplation and the right for laziness, but probably under another name, is an essential aspect of being a citizen. You can't be a citizen if you're consumed by insecurities, being a precariat person, having no control of your time between consumption and labor and work and frenetic activities. You can't have enough time to be a citizen. That's why at the root of the whole drama, the whole tragedy of the precariat today is the commodification of our education system, which is turning millions of people into atomized pieces of human capital, rather than as citizens with rights and understanding and the time and the knowledge of their history and their culture in order to develop that sense of future. And I think this is a very good question, because we should have more respect for idleness and more respect for control of our time. So thank you for the question.
Thanks. The next question is from Gustavo Nicolau Gonçalves. What do you think about cooperativism and solidarity economy in the form of platform co-ops as a possible future that left wings could use to inspire the progresses of the precariat? Well,
thank you for that question too. I I think that the sense of cooperativism and guild socialism of the early 20th century is very relevant to our predicament today. In a sense, it's about one of the most fundamental aspects of the class structure and the rentier capitalism, which has been systematic deprivation of the commons. We need to revive the commons. My last book, 2019, is called The Plunder of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth. And the essence of the argument is that with privatization and rentier capitalism, the commons have been lost. The commons were the focus in history of commoning, shared activities, collaborative activities, where the reciprocities were built into the communities and the security was provided by the commons. If you plunder the commons, you increase inequalities without it being shown up in the statistics that they use to measure inequalities, but they're real. The Precariat needs the commons. That's the theme of that book. And for me, it's a matter of marrying the concern over the commons with the concerns of the Precariat and having an ecological transformation built around those two agendas. So for me, cooperativism has to be part of the solution, but it has to probably be in a very open way that's different from the Owen's idea of cooperatives at the beginning of the 19th century, for example, or even the Spanish example that everybody likes to cite. But I think that the principles of cooperativism and reciprocities and what the Africans call Ubuntu are fundamentally important for the future.
Thanks. The next question is mine too. Professor Standen, can you talk more about your proposal for basic income? A little few words.
Yeah, I was invited last year to do a video with massive attack about why I believe that the basic income is needed now. It's gone viral on YouTube. Essentially, I think a basic income should not be seen as a standalone policy. It's a policy that we should be moving towards, which should be justifiable on three levels. One is it's a matter of common justice. The wealth and income of all of us is far more to do with what our ancestors handed down to us, including the commons, than anything we do ourselves. And in a sense, if we allow for private inheritance of private wealth, we should have an idea of public inheritance of public wealth. But it can only be fair if everybody has an equal basic income. One can also talk about religious justice. If you want to be religious, I'm not, but if you do, then you could say God has given us unequal talents, and some people don't have the talent of making money. And therefore, a basic income would be a matter of compensating those who don't have equal talents. And it's also a principle of saying, in practical terms, the only way of giving everybody basic security is to have a universal type scheme with barriers for migrants to pass, they have to wait for a while and so on, but for everybody, and then you tax back from the wealthy. Means testing targeted benefits never work. They never work. There are always high exclusion errors. There are always poverty traps and precarity traps. And that leads to the second justification, which is basic security is a human right. It's a public good in the sense that if you have security and I have security, we all benefit more than if only some people have security. And basic security is needed to give us our sense of control of time, our rationality, our ability to be rational. And the psychologists have taught us, surely, that if you're insecure, you can't be rational. Well, if that's the case, then how is it right the state hold people responsible for their actions if they contribute to that insecurity? And the third justification is that a basic income would enhance freedom. We've done pilots in Africa and India, and always found from the results that this sense of emancipation is vital, and it comes through people receiving a basic income. The emancipatory value is greater than the money value. It gives liberal freedom. Liberal freedom is the freedom to be moral. How can you be moral if you're being forced by the state or your circumstances to do whatever is necessary to survive? You can't be moral in those circumstances. You can't be moral if there's workfare facing you. You can't be moral if you have to do as you're told all the time. You can only be moral if you can make your own decisions. That leads to the final point, which is it enhances Republican freedom. This is very important for women in particular, because Republican freedom means not only that I can make those decisions and I can have the freedom of choice, but I can do so without having to ask anybody. I can do so of my own will. It's not freedom if a woman has to ask her partner if she can do X, Y, and Z, even if she knows that 99% of the time the partner will say yes. Freedom means the ability to make your own decisions. And a basic income will give resilience. It would give solidarity. It would be emancipatory. And in the context of this pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, it gives resilience to society and would deal with many of the inequalities that we're facing that cause inequalities of morbidity and so on. So for me, at the moment, during this pandemic, it's what Americans like to call a no-brainer. It's up to us to fight for it.
Wonderful. The next question is from Andriele Nascimento. The role of the unions are becoming less and less present in our times. How do you understand this issue? And I would add another question. You talk about the need of different forms of collective bodies. How to reimagine collective bodies?
This is a very good question, and I have a position that's made me enemies, if you like. I believe the old labor unions were very progressive for their time, the time of industrial citizenship, the post-Second World War period. They were very progressive, but they're now reactionary because they are defending laborism and the values of labor rather than the values of work and emancipation and ecology. We need collective bodies. We are all vulnerable unless there are collective bodies to which we can belong. I believe that the collective bodies that we should be favoring are those geared to occupational security, what you do, how you develop your capacities, and an ecological sustainable agenda driving them. I support 100% the Extinction Rebellion. I think the Extinction Rebellion should also be involved in a social rebellion that's geared to reorienting what we mean by work. We are human beings who want to work, who want also to leisure. We need to reinvent the verb to leisure, because it's not the same thing as consumption or recuperation or even sport. All of these things are needed, but to leisure means to become a public participant in the polis, in the life of the agora. And you can only do that if you have security and if you have bodies that represent those interests. I think it's beginning. There's wonderful movements out there. We have to convert them into bodies that are reinventing this sense of future, not just attacking the past. That should be done, but also focusing on how would we like to live tomorrow. And that, I think, is what has been lacking in the trade unions around the world. And that's why they've dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. And I say that with sadness, but I think they deserve it, I'm afraid.
Thanks. The next question is from Dante Pesin. Could be a good strategy the government begins to produce statistics and indicators about the commons. I would replace this about how is the relationship about government and commons.
My goodness, this is a separate talk, but and I love it, the question. I've tried to address it in my book on the plunder of the commons in drawing up a manifesto, which has got 44 articles. And I think that the idea of measurement, the idea of identifying the commons, the different type of commons, is a very exciting one, but we must be careful. We must be careful not to fall into the neoliberal trap of talking about natural capital, which is a ruse to give a value to the commons in order to determine the price that it could be sold to private equity or to big corporations, which is precisely what has been happening around the world. I do urge anybody who's going to undertake something like you seem to have in mind to bear in mind the following. The commons are divided into 5 types. Natural commons, including the sea, including the land, including the resources under both, including the air, including the water, and so on. The parks, that's the natural common. But it also includes the social commons, the institutions and the monuments and the things that we've inherited down the ages. There's a lovely phrase I use in the book, of time out of mind of man. In other words, they've been inherited by us. These are part of the social commons. They give us our society, they give us our culture, they give us our structures, security. And then there is also, part of the social commons include things like the National Health Service in Britain, which it became a commons in 1968 when it had existed for 20 years. The old rule was that something that existed as a social institution for 20 years or more became part of the commons. But there are also civil commons, the civil institutions that are meant for equal access. The tragedy for the Precariat today is they've lost the civil commons. They don't get access to justice. Civil commons means that every single person should have equal access to justice and that justice should respect due process. How do you measure that? You can do it, but it's different from the others. The same with cultural commons. Cultural commons mean that we have equal access to institutions of our choosing, our culture, and equal respect to all cultures as part of a cultural commons. It's defined that way. And finally, there's the knowledge commons. The knowledge commons, which is education, information, and ideas. One of the worst aspects, if not the worst aspect, of rentier capitalism in the world today is the loss of the intellectual commons. And that's been due to the conversion of more and more ideas into private property. Thomas Jefferson famously said, the very idea of turning ideas into property is disgusting. He didn't put those words, but that's roughly what he was saying. And he used the word embarrassment. The thing today is that more and more ideas are captured for private property and private profit. There are something like 15 million patents in operation as we sit here talking, and they are providing monopolistic profits to corporates, plutocrats, who make their billions that way. The commons must rescue ideas for the commoners. And I think that has to be measured in different ways too. But I applaud the idea behind the question.
Thank you very much, Professor Geistenden. It was very good to talk to you today. I hope you can come to Brazil again very soon with another president and so on. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. See you there. Gente, a gente se encontra na próxima segunda-feira. No DigiLabour Conversation, a gente tem, no DigiLabour Summer School, a gente vai ter mais 2 conversas. Teve uma adicional na segunda-feira da semana que vem, na segunda agora, a gente conversa com a Kylie Jarrett, às 10 da manhã, com a conferência Do the Hustle. Ela vai lançar o livro agora, Digital Labor, e ela foi a keynote speaker ano passado do evento da Association of Internet Researchers. E na quinta-feira da semana que vem, a última atividade com a professora Jenny Chen, que vai falar sobre o livro Dying for an iPhone. E aí encerramos o DigiLabour Summer School na quinta-feira da semana que vem. Lembramos que quem não assina ainda a newsletter DigiLabour, digilabor.com.br, domingo a gente vai lançar a entrevista com o professor Aaron Benanav, que é autor do livro Automation and the Future of Work. Esperamos vocês lá. Um abraço, uma ótima quinta-feira para vocês todos.